Professor John Compton received his PhD from Harvard University in 1986 and moved to UCT in 1996. He has published over 60 papers, journal articles spanning a wide range of research topics. He is now emeritus and focuses on publishing natural history books with 3 titles to date, namely The Rock and Mountains of Cape Town, Human Origins, How Diet, Climate and Landscape Shapes Us, and last but not least, the book that you see on the cover of your screen, West Coast, A Natural History. Please visit his website. He's got such fantastic information there. The website simply goes for www.johnscompton.com, www.johnscompton.com, and it's all one word. So johnscompton.com. Please check it out. I think you'll be blown away. Prof, without any waste of time, let me give over to you.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, John, and welcome everyone and good morning. Wherever you are, I hope everyone is well, and thank you for joining me. As John said, I've recently focused more on writing books on natural history. You can maybe tell from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, but we've lived here now in South Africa for over 25 years. And my latest book there is on the left-hand side, West Coast of Natural History. It just came out this year. And a lot of what I want to talk about to you today comes from that book. It's not everything from that book. And the book covers more than I'll be able to present in this morning's lecture. But basically what I want to focus on this morning is an aspect of geology that intrigues me a lot, and one which I have had the pleasure of working with a number of colleagues and students over the years while at UCT. And that's this relationship between the bedrock geology, the underlying foundation, if you will, and the plants, and how the plants relate to that underlying geology. And I hope to show you this morning what an amazing relationship actually exists between bedrock and soils, and hence plant communities, often referred to as plant biomes. And the picture on the right there shows you, this is Platyclip Gorge. Maybe many of you have climbed it up to Table Mountain. And it shows you the very resistant quartz sandstone rocks above, forming these cliffs, and the very distinct, pretty well-known, highly diverse Fynbos sandstone mountain sandstone Fynbos community, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, let me just start by saying, what do I mean by the West Coast? So various definitions of how we can define the West Coast, but basically what I mean by the West Coast is that region to the west, from Cape Town that stretches all the way up into Lüderitz and southern Namibia. And this is an amazing image. This is a composite satellite image from NASA. And it's rendered to have the least amount of cloud cover, so you can really see the topography and the land. And as many of you would be familiar, the vegetation on the West Coast is quite distinct from the rest of the country. And in part, that's because of how dry it is. So on the East Coast, we have the lushness, the humidity, the warm Agulhas current, and all that moisture. And very little of that moisture manages to get over to the West Coast. We, of course, get our rain in the winter months primarily, so a Mediterranean type climate. And for me, that's familiar because I grew up in California, which also has a Mediterranean type climate. But of course, the plants are completely different. So what I want to try to do is we'll take a bit of a few close-ups of the vegetation and the rocks along the West Coast and look at how they are linked. And first, I'd just like to point out that we can already link landscape to the bedrock geology. And so in this image, on the left-hand side, you can see the topography, where it combines. In the blue is the offshore continental shelf. And there you can see, for example, let me get out my little laser pointer. You can see this amazing scar offshore of Cape Columbine. This is Cape Columbine. Cape Town is down here. This shows you this amazing erosional scar. Here's the second one down here. This is the Cape Canyon. And if we go on land, the green and yellow areas are the low-lying coastal plain, and the warmer orangish colors are the mountains. So here's the Cape Fold Belt, the Cedarburg Mountains. Here's Cape Honcliffe. And then inland, we have the raised plateau, this very large, extensive region in southern Africa that's elevated at elevations of around 12 to 1600 meters. And here we can see the great escarpment beautifully displayed along the margin of the Tonquin Karoo. So basically the mountains, the Cape Fold Belt Mountains, are made up of these dark blue and light blue sections here of the resistant sandstone. The coastal plain and the Swartland is made up of the weathered shale, the Mossbury Shale, and then the granite, which forms low-lying hills like the Darling Hills on the west coast, and the granite on Cape Columbine and along Longaban Lagoon. So that's one relationship. And then if we go to this image, this shows you again the geology map produced here on the left. And in general, the relationship holds that for the different major rock types, like the Cedarburg Mountains and Cape Fold Belt, we have the sandstone fame moss, for example. And in the lowland weathered shales in the south and on the west coast, we have the Rhinosterfeld, which is a more grass-rich biome in the lowland areas and more nutrient-rich based on the more nutrient-rich soils. Now, what I want to do is I want to just show you, this shows you very generally on a large scale, but we're going to zoom in on the Cape Peninsula down here in the southwestern corner, which I think most of you are familiar with that area. And I'll just start by saying this sort of detailed map of the plant biomes is available in beautiful color maps from the book, wonderful book put out by Musina and Rutherford as editors, The Vegetation of South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland. This is the Strelitzia volume 19. And when I first saw this book, it came out in 2006. When I first saw this book, I was absolutely struck by the fact that these plant biome maps, which are very intricate, how closely related they are to the geology. So to help you see that, in the middle here, I've put a geological map. Here's Cape Town, the city of Cape Town. There's Robben Island offshore. And this, of course, is the extent all the way down to Cape Point. And so, for example, this light blue color on the Cape Peninsula is dominated by the Peninsula Formation sandstone. And if we look over at the plant biomes, we see that this dark purple is the Peninsula Sandstone fame moss. And at the lower elevations to the north, we have this very bright reddish pink color. That relates to the granite fame moss. And if we go further to the north, where the city is located, here would be Signal Hill. This is underlain by the Rhinosterfeld. And if we go out onto the Cape Flats, where we have the dune sand, we have the dune fame moss, and we have the Strandfeld vegetation. And we can see this at the detail of, if you look here, there are windblown dune sands that come up onto the sandstone. And this is reflected here in the geological map. And these are, again, the sand fame moss next door to the sandstone fame moss. And I think the other point I'd like to emphasize, the one that I find quite amazing, we'll see some examples of it in this talk, how radically different the vegetation is between areas that are immediately adjacent. And really the only thing that's varying is the substrate. And in some cases, not even the substrate, but you get an amazing diversity of plants. And these are very well partitioned to the type of rock that's underlying them. And you don't get a lot of overlap between those two different biomes or vegetation types. So if we look, here's that picture I showed you earlier, the Peninsula Sandstone fame boss. It's growing on very nutrient poor, acidic quartz sand soils because the soil's being weathered from these very resistant sandstones, which are shown here in this cliff face. And that's why, of course, they form cliffs, is because the sandstone is so resistant to being eroded. That the way you can erode it, the most effective way, is to undercut the stuff below it, over steepen the slope, and then have the rock fall. And so these rocks out here are projecting into space, and eventually gravity will pull them down, and you'll often find fallen rocks, of course, on the lower slopes. So in the case of the Peninsula Sandstone fame boss, we see the famous Protea, here with one with a white flower. There is the Restios, which are these reed-type plants without leaves. You have the Ericas, these orange flowering small shrubs, heathers, and you have the geophytes, like these bladed lilies, which have the bulb, the subterranean bulb, and they're the ones that first come out after fire. So a very rich, diverse plant community. But interestingly, one that largely lacks trees. To find trees, you have to go into the gorges, the deep cut erosional gorges, such as Skeleton Gorge, Nursery Ravine, and others. And there you're going to find a completely different assemblage of plants, these beautiful old growth trees, mosses, ferns, etc., with very little overlap with the surrounding fame boss plants. So one of the key botanical questions is, how do we explain the general absence of trees? Why are they restricted primarily to these deep gorges? And there's various debates about whether it's the fire element, that the gorges are protected from the fire. Is it a wind factor, because the gorges are also more protected from the strong southeast wind in the summer? Or is it water? You know, the gorges provide a focusing for water to be focused into those gorges, and maybe that's a major factor. But it's interesting, in the book I discuss this example about 100 meters west of the King's Blockhouse on the contour path. You'll run into a very large rock fall. I don't know how well you can see it on this picture on the left, but you'll see large blocks of rock that have piled up on the slope. And this is a north-facing slope that has no real indigenous tree growth normally or elsewhere on the slope. And then on the right, this is a close-up. It shows you these blocks of rock are as big as a small car, and they have piled up there below the cliff face. And what you see are these indigenous trees growing within this rock fall. And it's sort of like it's a positive corollary to the negative gorge. So instead of cutting a deep gorge like at Skeleton, you've actually piled up rocks and made a fire break, a wind break. And that seems to have allowed bird-dropped seeds of trees to sprout and grow up through these cracks. And they've done quite well. They're also protected from fire. Once they get big enough, though, they are vulnerable to fire. But then what happens is they just restart again. Now, one of the key issues locally, certainly in the Cape Town area, is around conservation. And what we can see from this diagram is shows you three images. On the far left, we have the biomes, the plant communities that existed prior to farming, as best as we could determine. In the middle diagram, it shows you what remains today after farming. And basically, you can see that this large patch of pink, which is the Renosterfeld has basically been obliterated. There are little patches of it that still remain. And like on the top of the Tigerberg, and the lowland sand fame moss, shown here in this green, has also largely been wiped out. Whereas the Cape sandstone, the mountain sandstone fame moss that I showed you earlier, like on Table Mountain, is relatively pristine. And that's, of course, reflecting the fact that A, the soils are very nutrient poor and not suitable for farming, except for rooibos tea and protea flowers. And also because it's very rugged, it'd be very difficult to farm in those regions because of the rocky outcrops and difficulties. So those are in pretty good shape. It's the Cape Flats area, which have been so heavily developed by urban growth and also farming, that has destroyed a lot of these lowland plant communities. So one solution is to, of course, develop conservation areas, and this map on the right shows you in green and different colors those that have been set up. And then the other idea is to try to connect these areas through what are called corridors, conservation corridors, these winding, twisting things that try to connect these different areas so that insects, birds, plants, animals can hopefully exist within the entire ecosystem that includes the plants. And I'm just going to show you this one up here is the Blauberg Conservation Area, which is locally. And if you go there, what you'll find is that portions of it are heavily infested with Port Jackson, which is an Australian acacia brought in to stabilize the dunes, which it does a very good job of doing, but has then since spread to other areas. And what you can see here in this image on the left is that the Port Jackson has basically pushed aside all of the amazing diverse species of lowland fame moss plants and has basically taken over. So the way to try to fix this is to remove these plants. It's a very difficult job because they produce prodigious numbers of seeds that form a huge soil seed bank, and they keep resprouting. But one option is to use these gall-forming rust fungus that helps reduce the number of seeds that they produce. But it's a major task, one which the Working for Water program and others have focused on, and a major effort. And they've made good headway in the Blauberg conservation area, but there's still a lot to be done. Other examples of preservation include like the Kenilworth Racecourse and the Rondebosch Common, again, not ideally conserved, but it does still retain some of the lowland acid sand fame moss community of plants that have been so heavily impacted by development. And then, as I mentioned, the Renosterfeld has been essentially wiped out because it's ideal for farming, all the lovely winter wheat that's now growing in canola fields that you can see up the west coast. And these are pictures from the top of the Tigerberg, and you can see the Renosterboss, the classic bush of Renosterfeld, and also a fair number of grasses. So it might have been quite a rich grassy community. Certainly has a lot of distinct bulbs as well, the geophytes within it. And as many are aware, there's also an effort to reclaim areas that were originally taken over for things like plantations. So this shows you a pine plantation in the Kai Forest, where in the background you have a single alien species, which has basically obliterated again the chance for any indigenous growth or really any other species growth. And outside of that, this line across here shows you this now rich diversity of shrubland, a lowland shrubland that grows in this area. It's specific here to granite, slightly more granitic than, say, the Rondebosch Common, which is more quartz sand based. So this is an effort to reclaim these areas that were used for commercial uses to restore some of the indigenous plants and to try to conserve them. Another area where plants have been well conserved is the Cougar Power Station. There's a nature reserve there, and you can go there. It's a lovely spot for walks. It's a little bit odd to see the nuclear reactors in the distance, but it's an example of a well-preserved, conserved area. And it has the strandfelt vegetation, which is also basically a shrubland with elements of some grasses in it. And if we look at it in the Longaban Lagoon area, where it's also well developed, this is on within the park, and you can see this sort of 1 to 2 meter high shrubland, very rich, and it's slightly more nutrient rich than the sandstone fane boss, and it gets woody berried shrubs, which provide food for birds and ungulate tortoises and other animals. So a slightly more nutrient rich and fairly well conserved plant biome, because the soils are not particularly, they're not particularly lend themselves to farming, except for maybe grazing. And if we go further north, this is St. Helena Bay. And here we have Picketberg, Citrusdal, Clan William going up the N7 towards Von Reinsdorf. And this is another example of creating conservation areas with corridors. So if you look at the image on the left, you can see just how biodiverse this area is, because each of these colors is representing different plant communities, many of which relate, as I mentioned, specifically to the type of rock substrate or soil substrate that they're growing on. And so the idea here is to try to have these reserves and then connect them with these corridors, as I mentioned, for the Cape Flats area, Cape Town area, here on a slightly bigger scale, and hopefully connecting coastal communities into the Olifants River Valley communities with mountainous communities of the Cedarburg, all the way to the Great Escarpment, which you see here on the far right. If we zoom in, this is the St. Helena Bays up here in the north. This is the Picketberg Mountains here, this triangular feature. Here's the Swartland, here are the Cedarburg Mountains to the right. And here's Saldanha Bay and Longaban Lagoon, just to orient you. And several things I want to point out in this image. One is you can see the diversity of different types of plants, biomes. There's a granite strandfeld, limestone strandfeld, dune strandfeld. You have salt marsh, salt pans. You have the Swartland shell rhinosterfeld covering huge areas of the lowland. And you have the lowland sand fane balls, where the sand has covered the rhinosterfeld, covered the weathered shale. And in the mountainous areas, as I mentioned, they don't farm extensively. They do farm to some extent, but not like on the lowlands. And one of the features of the so-called Anthropocene, the human epoch, the one in which humans have had a huge impact on Earth, which we're witnessing as we live today, is the alteration of the landscape. And one of the big alterations has been that primarily through farming, we have altered around 75% of the ice-free land surface on Earth, which is really quite astounding. And I don't think you'll have any trouble believing that number when you look at this satellite image. You can see all this patchwork, like quilt-like patchwork of fields. So obviously the Berg River empties out here. The Berg River Dam was built to help supply the irrigation to allow for extensive agriculture all along here. And if you drive through here, as I did last week, you'll see bountiful fields of winter wheat, canola, vineyards, orange groves, etc. So very fertile area, but the price we've paid for that is that we've pretty much obliterated the natural lowland sand fane boss and the shell rhinosterfeld, to the point where we don't actually even really know what the rhinosterfeld was composed of originally. It's been that altered. So this shows you a picture looking west from the Piccaninny's Cliff Pass. You can pull over there on the N7 at the pass and have a look. It's beautiful view looking west. And it's showing you these very green irrigated crop fields for agriculture. That's where their Nostafelt was originally. And looking across to the mountains of the Picketberg, which are relatively pristine and have the original sandstone vein moss still there. Then let's go over to the coast. This is the Longaban Lagoon. This shows it on the left from an aerial photo. And this is from a plane taking, looking north. So here's Saldanha Bay. And you see this beautiful lagoon. And we're going to look at some of the coastal communities, the Strandfeld communities on this dune ridge. We're going to look at some of the Salt Marsh communities here. Very rich, diverse area. I often recommend to people that they start at Seaberg because you can see well from there. Looking west, you can look over to Possberg, and these are the granite hills of Possberg, which is open during flower season. And then here's Crawl Bay, a popular picnic spot. And these, to start with, the granites are interesting. You do get a granite strandfeld, a granite specific strandfeld that grows there. But on the granite itself, you'll see in this one in the foreground is all covered with orange lichens. And here's a close-up of the richness and diversity of the lichens. Now, lichens are the first organisms to colonize bare rock. And they're very important for starting the process of chemically weathering the rock into soil that then can support larger plants that are grazed on by daisies, the hyrax, for example, shown here. And lichens are a fungal algal symbiont, and they're very prolific and very abundant, and it's absolutely essential in the growth of larger plants. Now, if we go to the southern end of the lagoon, there are beautiful examples of the Salt Marsh. This circle here shows you the Heelbeck Visitor Center, shown here in the distance on the picture on the right. And basically, you've got lovely, large expanses of salt marsh here. Here's a close-up on the right taken from the boardwalk as you walk out to the bird hide. So you're not allowed to walk on the salt marsh because you'll trample it. It's very sensitive. But if you walk on the boardwalk, you can go out and have beautiful views. It's multicolored salicornias and other succulents. And these plants are able to withstand high amounts of salt. And hence grow in these quite salty areas. And then the salt marsh will grade as you get away from the salty areas more into rushes, juncus, and cordgrass, spartina. And in the far distance here, this light beige color material here is Pragmitis, which are freshwater reeds, because there's actually a freshwater seep that comes in from these hills and comes out here at Heelbeck, and that's why it was a farm, because it had good sources of groundwater that seep out and form these patches of Phragmites, freshwater reeds. If you go towards the lagoon, you see these lovely displays of bladed eelgrass, which grows in the muddy sediment that accumulates within the salt marsh. The other nice, interesting feature nearby is the dune system. So this shows you, here's in the middle diagram here, this is Eysterfontein. Here's the beach at Eysterfontein. And from here, the winds carry the sand, fine sand, inland into this large dune cordon shown here in yellow. Here's an aerial photo on the far left here of the active dune field, which you can walk to. You can walk in here and explore it. There are people in it for scale. You get 15, 20-meter high dunes. And the dunes are distinctive as well in terms of their vegetation. And one of the animals that lives there and does a constant job of mixing up the sediment is the Cape dune mole rat. So these shows these large burrows. I have them also in my garden, as I think many do. And these dunes are actively advancing. So this shows you in the foreground with the lovely flowers and the mature shrubs, older established vegetation that's getting literally buried by this advancing dune front. And this advancing dune front is maybe coming as much as, up to several to 5 meters a year. And of course, it kills the underlying vegetation and you get a new dune felt vegetation that's very distinct from the one it's burying. And in fact, if you go between the Atlantic Ocean and Longaban Lagoon, shown here on the left, you get what you can refer to as a chronosequence. Okay, so you can see on here, here's the surf, here's the beach running here, and you get the whitest dunes, the least vegetated dunes first. That's where the active wind-blowing sand is, and that's shown here on the right. They're partially vegetated by pioneer species, that dune species that are established and can tolerate a lot of wind and salt. As they go inland, you get more vegetated dunes, but still calcareous. And then this dashed line separates an even older series of dunes where the calcite from the sand has largely been leached out, and they're more of a pure quartz sand. And you get a very different set of plants that are growing there. So from yesterday's wind to up to maybe about a couple thousand years old is this white zone. Then this one in the back goes back maybe about 6,000 years. And this old vegetated dune is going back to around 120,000 years ago. So quite interesting changes in the plant communities. The substrate's largely similar, but the ages are different. And here's a patch of salt marsh up against the lagoon that dates from probably the last several hundred years. And we have records of the older vegetation in the West Coast, although plants don't preserve as well as animal fossils, as shown here at the West Coast Fossil Park. But we know that there were large groups of these large animals, these short-necked giraffes called civethirs. You had elephants that are now, a species of which are now extinct. You had Africa's only bear. So very interesting assemblage of animals, which tells us that there must have been a lot of plant material for them to feed on, because the civethir was a herbivore, as was the elephant, and it must have been much wetter and much more productive back 5 million years ago. The other thing that's important to remember is that the landscape we see today has changed in the past relative to sea level. So during past periods of maximum ice buildup in the Northern Hemisphere, when you had woolly mammoths and things in Siberia and in North America, sea level was much lower. It was 130 meters lower. And that's shown here by this white line running across here. And it's particularly dramatic in the southern part. Here's the Breeder River comes out here at Wittbank, and it basically would have extended and flowed all the way down here. And this would have been the shoreline 20,000 years ago. So you can see that the coastal plain is greatly expanded during these periods of lower sea level. And that's important because that would have allowed for different plant communities to be established in different environments. And then as sea level rose again and flooded those areas, some plants would have survived and remained on the coastal plain, others might have gone extinct. So I want to show you a blow up here, which is off of the Cape Agulhas danger point here, and just show you that we can relate, because we know what this diagram shows you is in this upper corner, upper right, you have, here's the present day shoreline in black, here's danger point. And these are the biomes we know exist, and they very much relate to the rocky substrate. So some are on shale, some are on sandstone, some are on granite. And we know the offshore geology, so we're able to extrapolate what the likely plant communities would have been offshore at the time 20,000 years ago when sea level was lowered and our strand line was way out here. So where we know enough about the offshore geology, we can extrapolate from what we know about the onshore to what might have been growing offshore in the past. And that can be applied on a larger scale. This shows you all of Southern Africa, and it shows you the expansion, especially in the southern coastal plain. And we can then project the major biomes potentially onto that coastal plain. It becomes more tricky in the southern part because we're not entirely sure what the substrate would have been offshore. But on our west coast here, the substrate's fairly well established, and we have a good idea of what would probably be growing there. And interestingly, on the south coast, we get a limestone fynbos, which does not really appear on the west coast. And that might be because it was separated from this Renosterfeld and sandstone fynbos communities of the Cape Fold Belt that didn't allow for it to extend yet to the west coast. The other indicator of a wetter, potentially wetter, more plant-rich community in the past are the Hulefkeys. These are termite mounds, ancient termite mounds. You see them here in yellow flowers, and they form these circular patterns. They're very common on the landscape once you learn to look for them. And this is the Moscom on the N7 near Clover. And you see these beautiful displays of Hulefkeys, especially during flower season. So if you go up there now, you'll see beautiful displays of these. And the interpretation is that these represent remnants of a much wetter, more vegetated terrain than exists today, and the existence of those large termite mounds, much larger than the termite mounds that are formed today. And if you go further north, you'll get into Namaqualand, of course, with the famous Microland Daisies, and these lovely sculpted, rounded terrains from the billion-year-old rocks that underlie the Namaqualand, the granites and gneisses. Also of interest is the succulent Karoo shrubland, which is near Von Reinsdorp, where you get an amazing diversity of succulents, as well as in the Richtersveld further to the north. And there in the distance, you can see the Great Escarpment. And on this ancient, very weathered coastal plain, you get these amazing variety of succulents on display. You have to look carefully to find them, but they're there, and each one is quite unique and interesting. So to sort of close off, I just want to show this slide as sort of emblematic of some of the issues that we face around the plants. So this is from the Darling Hills area. In the distance, you can see there's the crest of a hill of granite. These are obviously heavily plowed for agriculture, but this gives an example. This is probably maybe winter wheat or lucerne and the canola fields. Here's an active farm here in the middle. But the very tops of the granite hills are unfarmed because they're rocky, difficult to plow. They've probably been grazed, but they haven't been plowed. So that represents one little island of somewhat preserved granite biomes on the top of that hill. And it's really in the lowland areas, which we see here in the foreground, that are most vulnerable, as I mentioned, because they're usually agriculturally the richest and the most easily farmed. And this is an example of a small reserve, the Teeny Versfeld Reserve. It's just off the turnoff to the Darling and Esterfontein turnoff. It's well worth a visit. In spring again, it's got beautiful flowers. And it gives an example, to my mind, that, you know, we need to adapt to this new world, and we need to conserve as much of what remains of the plant biomes, and that they're so unique and specific to the substrate. But we obviously also need to grow food, so we can try to manage and have farms that are productive, but that also include these conservation areas and corridors. And there's active farming groups, for example, in the Elgin Basin, who form a consortium, and farmers agree to set aside land for conservation, and they do it strategically so that they're within these corridors. So hopefully we can continue to grow food that we need to eat, but we can also conserve the very rich plant diversity that this region is so well known for. And then in closing, I just wanted to mention, yes, that I've written 3 books now on various aspects of natural history. And the first one that came out was The Rocks and Mountains of Cape Town, which talks about the local Geology, Environment, the Cape Town Area. The second book is Human Origins, How Diet, Climate, and Landscape Shaped Us, and that's available as well. It emphasizes the impact of many of the changes I've talked about in terms of sea level on human evolution in Southern Africa. So for example, people are talking about creating a cradle of human culture for the South and West Coast. And then just published is this West Coast book on natural history, which comprises of a lot of different topics about the West Coast. And as I mentioned, it's on special through the Botanical Society bookshop, 15% off. And then for anyone who misses that sale or wants to order the other books, the bookshop also has my other books there. If it's more convenient or you'd like to, you can also visit my website, the address given here. And from that website, you can learn more about each of the 3 books and download an order form, which is refilled. You can fill it out, type on it, and just return it to me at my email address shown here, john.compton@uct.ac.za. And I will happily send you the books. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to open the floor for questions. If I can.
Prof.
Yeah.
Amazing. Really looking, I think some really thought-provoking inputs that you've given us. Yeah, it's absolutely, I think it's just so interesting to look at the landscape in the manner that you presented it. And I think perhaps maybe to kick us off with some questions, I just want to ask you perhaps maybe to give us a quick reflection and just your perspective in terms of, I think the whole world currently is faced with climate change. How has climate change impacted on the landscape as you've presented to us? And how is that, is the landscape that we see today going to be the same in future? And how is that impacted in terms of a geological perspective?
Yeah, I think from a geological perspective, the landscape is pretty much impervious to much of what's going on human timescales. But what's very important, for example, is the West Coast, as I mentioned, is generally dry, right? Especially as you go north. You see that very dramatically as you drive north. And so one of the big issues for life on the West Coast is water. I mean, after all, Cape Town's where it is because it had fresh water. Would have been at Saldanha Bay if there was fresh water. There really wasn't. So we've been humans have always been confined to this very big limitation that we need fresh water. That's an absolute essential. And I think we all certainly remember the drought that we just went through in Cape Town, right? The 3-year drought. So I think where climate impacts will be greatest will be in both increased and perhaps severity in drought, and coming up with solutions to where we can get enough water to grow the agriculture we need, and of course to live our lives, very, very essential. The other area in which climate change could have a big impact is, of course, on the coast as sea level rises. So we know sea level has been rising for the last century. It's probably going to continue to rise as the sea warms and ice melts. And so coastal areas will become more and more prone to erosion. And those people living on the coast are going to find themselves perhaps having to move or to be displaced, or the government will have to spend huge amounts of money in replenishing and protecting those coastal areas. So I think those are the 2 big areas, sea level rise and drought. Fortunately, we don't get hurricanes here. Tornadoes, very rare. So I think those would be, and just the unpredictability in the arrival of rain, which is absolutely critical to the farmers.
Yeah, I think, because also when we were presenting, the first thing that came to mind was obviously with erosion, all the water just literally, rushes over and it's not properly absorbed into the surface of the earth. And also just, day zero was just such a scare to all of us. And I think also as a last parting question from my side, before I take some of the questions that are coming up on the line, would be, you know, how is the current landscape from a geological perspective adjusting itself to be able to provide water security? I think for the past few months now, we've seen some great rains. I think our dams are looking pretty good, but what is the impact in terms of a geological perspective? Can we safely say the environment is preparing and shaping itself to be able to give us a more sustainable water solution, water savings, like you presented?
Well, it's not doing it for us, but what we can do is discover ways in which the earth provides us alternatives. So for example, not all water is surface runoff, right? Not all water runs in rivers to the ocean and fills dams. Some of it seeps deep in the earth to become what we call groundwater. So one of the big projects in the Cape has been to try to see about extracting huge volumes of water that naturally exist within the rocks. It's kind of like an underground dam, if you like to think of it, but you have to pump it out with a borehole or have it hydraulically fed from uphill to downhill. And so I think the city, is obviously making a big effort to explore the extraction of water from underground. And there is a lot of water underground, and a lot of it is good quality. They currently do it, for example, at Citrus Ball to irrigate, and it's very good water. The other option there is we have huge amounts of fresh water in the Antarctic ice sheet. That's where most fresh water resides, is in ice. So one of the proposals, quite interesting, is to ferry or tug a large iceberg from off of Antarctica to Cape Town, and then extract the meltwater to use for water supply. So I think or you can desalinate the ocean, right? But that's expensive, takes a lot of energy, and produces a very salty brine. So, I think nature provides for us some solutions. We just have to be clever enough to know how to get at those without bad consequences. So you don't want to overdraw your groundwater, or else natural springs might go dry, and that would affect ecosystems that rely on those springs. You don't want to tow an iceberg here if it's going to mess with the marine ecosystem that's not used to having icebergs, those sorts of things. But nature does offer us some solutions, but we have to be creative and careful in how we, exploit those.
Yeah, sure. Prof, I think we're living in scary times. The impact of climate change, what we went through with the whole day zero concept in the mother city, and just rising sea levels, like you said. I think we just, and now in terms of pandemics. Anyway, let me just take a couple of questions quickly,
Sure.
Prof. From George and Margot, and I think you'll see some of the questions kind of repeating themselves in terms of, concerns about water. Starting off with saying, great talk. You convincingly demonstrated the geology or plant links on land. Does local geology also influence either estuarine or coastal plant life? Or is water movement too great to allow such local effects? From George Branch.
Hey, good morning, George. Good question. Yeah, I think it does, because if you look at the offshore bathymetry, which I showed you, which by the way is on this map behind me, if people can see that.
Yeah.
That was a MSc project recently published by a student of mine, Willem de Vet. But at any rate, so where you get these offshore substrates, you can get the rocky substrate, which, as you know, supports a very different marine community than will the sandy substrates, say, or the muddy substrates. So certainly the geological formations extend offshore onto the shelf, and they exert an influence in terms of what sort of plants, well, algae and kelp marine organisms can grow there, and then what sort of fish and other organisms. So I suspect it may not be quite as strong as on land, but certainly the substrates would be highly variable in parts of the offshore, particularly the near inshore, where wave action can keep these rocks free of sediment. As you go further offshore, the substrate becomes much more uniform and would be less variable. But in the near inshore, certainly would have a big impact on probably the biological communities living offshore.
Sure. Prof, let me take two questions from one of our callers on the line. Let me take two of them at the same time. He says, you spoke about the dunes around Longaban area advancing inland at about 5 meters per year. Is this a natural phenomenon, or is it something resulting from a damaged landscape? And if so, this is absolutely worrying. What can we do about it? Let me just take another one quickly, which says the geology of Overberg Renosterfield is fairly complex compared to the Swartland Renosterfield. Why is this? What process caused this? Perhaps maybe you can share some ideas there.
Okay, so the first question about the dune field between Esterfontein and Kielbeck. Okay, that dune system is totally natural in the sense that it pre-existed. The Atlantis dune field is also another example, as is the Cape Flats dune field. These are major dune fields that existed, and they are produced where wherever you get fine enough sands on the beach for the wind, the strong southeast wind, to carry them forward to the north. And it was, in fact, the problem of these dunes was, of course, if you wanted to build a road or a railway, you couldn't exactly have a 15-meter pile of sand coming across it periodically, right? That wouldn't really work. So that was the impetus for importing the Australian acacias. The Port Jackson, which I mentioned earlier, and the Roycons, those were brought in specifically like 150 years ago to stabilize those dunes, because people, wanted them stabilized by vegetation, and they did a very good job of that. Those plants were very successful in doing the job they were assigned. The problem was people didn't anticipate how quickly they would spread into other communities and become a major problem for us at this stage. So they, like, for example, the dune system at Heelbeck will eventually, if it's left to its own devices, will run into the R27 road, which would be a bit of a disaster. So they do try to maintain a planted dune system in the front of it to ensure that it doesn't advance all the way to the R27. And then the other question concerning the Shale Renosterfeld, it is similar on the Overberg to the Swartland because they're both based on shale bedrock, which is like a mudstone. And in the case of the Swartland, it's the Malmesbury group shales rock. And in the case of the Overberg, it's the Boca, which is a much younger, but also a marine shale mudstone. So those would be cases of similar bedrock material that weathers to give really nice, rich, loamy soils, and hence ideal for agriculture. These are deeply weathered, meters to tens of meters of weathered bedrock, and farmers can plow them and plant them, and they're naturally rich in clays and organic material that make them ideal for farming. So the plant communities are slightly different in terms of the species compositions, but certainly the overall composition is very similar and very distinct, right, from the sandstone one, or very distinct from the Afromontane one. Each one of these is amazing how distinct it is in terms of its composition of the type of species that make it up.
Sure. Prof, I have to admit, we've got some fascinating questions, and I think you are the only one qualified to answer all of these questions. So I think what we're going to do is, while we have everybody on the line, we just want to make a commitment that we'll take some of the questions, perhaps maybe Prof, get you to just make a short comment on some of them, and then
Sure.
we'll post them on social media. Please check out our social media pages. It will be Straight Nature Facebook page, as well as the Kirstenbosch National Botanical Facebook page. These recordings will also be available and live on those social media platforms. So please go and like those pages, check them out, check this talk, and also look at the commentaries that would have been posted there based on the questions that are coming up. I'm just looking at time, and Prof, I just want to take a couple of questions as well, because I think they're absolutely, they need your expertise. So,
I'll try to answer them.
So from David, and I think perhaps maybe we can keep it short so that we can get as many in as we possibly can. David is asking how is the sharp change of vegetation explained at the edge of the Swarthrakans in the series Karoo? He says fynbos. The questions are coming fast and furious now. That won't move too quickly. He says fynbos to succulent Karoo within kilometers, but with no apparent admixture. Is it simply the rainfall, or has it changed over the period of the glaciation that was mentioned? And let me take another one as well from Carolize. While we at it, says, how and when was the Boca Shale set down? Does the peninsula's geology have any connection with the Karoo supergroup beyond? I seem to remember being told there was a very high mountain range, as high as the Himalayas, down at the Cape a long time ago. All wrong, sort of all worn down. Is there any remnant for that?
Okay, I'll take the second question first. I talked quite a bit about that in the Rocks and Mountains book, but yes, the Boca Shale is younger than the Malmesbury. The Malmesbury Shale group shales are the oldest rocks that we have in the region. And the Boca Shale is part of the Karoo supergroup. And you're right, the Karoo supergroup was deposited largely from the erosion of the Cape Fold Belt when it originally formed. So what happened was the Cape supergroup sediments were deposited, and then the Gondwana assembly was completed, and in that the continents collided. And that's why the mountains are all contorted and folded and so forth with the Cape Fold Belt, and maybe they were once as high or comparable to mountain ranges such as the Himalayas today, which represents the collision of India into Asia. And many of these sediments were eroded into the Cape Basin, which was in the inland area. Much of it was in fresh water by rivers and lakes. And you deposited mudstones and sandstones and so forth. And the Boca Shale is not part of that. The Boca Shale is part of the Cape supergroup. It's not part of the Karoo succession. So let me just back up there. I misspoke. So the Boca Shale is a marine shale, and it represents a period of higher sea level during the time of Cape supergroup deposition. It is younger than the Malmesbury group shales, but it's a marine shale, and it's part of the Cape supergroup that got contorted during the collisions. It's got marine fossils in it, it's got organic matter in it, and it weathers into a good soil. So sorry, that it's not part of the Karoo supergroup. Then for the first question, yes, I think it's quite intriguing myself how quickly you'll transition from one plant community to another. And sometimes it's not obvious why. And I think I don't really even want to speculate in terms of the Karoo succulent biome transitioning from the renosterfeld and so forth. I have seen that sort of thing in the field. And I think a very good example, which I presented in this talk, was the transition from sandstone fame balls, peninsula sandstone fame balls, to the Afromontane. So that you can walk, from one to the other in, a space of 100 meters. And the transformation is dramatic. And so that shows an example where the immediate microenvironment is absolutely essential to what sort of plants are growing there. And I mentioned whether it was fire, wind, water, all these different components, but you can get dramatically different plant communities growing literally adjacent to one another on this, even the same substrate, in that case, the sandstone, but with very different microenvironments that lead to very different vegetation types. So in some cases, it is clearly a change in the substrate, the type of sediment, the soil. But in other cases, it can be microclimate driven and determining why you're getting specific changes. So I hope that answers that. And I'm sorry for confusion on the Karoo and Cape supergroup earlier.
No worries, Prof. Prof, let me take a couple. I think, like I said, I think I don't think we've seen as many questions as we have today. I think it's just from the fascinating presentation that you've given, and a lot of great comments coming up from the commentary saying, excellent talk, really insightful. And a lot of water questions coming up from Melinda, who says, can we see a positive difference in natural water supply with alien invasion clearing very active on the West Coast over the last couple of years? So do we see anything yet? And before you answer that, Prof, let me also take another water question that's coming from David, who says, some years ago, I worked with Christine Colvin on that mix of salt and freshwater mash in the southern end of the Longaban Lagoon. It must require quite a flow of fresh water to sustain it, as Pragmitis is not very salty tolerant. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that.
Pragmitis. Yeah, that's the freshwater reed, Pragmitis, yeah.
Oh, Pragmitis, yes. Do you know of any other studies of this environment?
Okay, so for the first question, that was about, well, okay, let me answer that one first. I'm sort of lost track of what the first question was, but for that second one, as far as Pragmitis goes, yeah, that's an underground, well, it's an aquifer, basically. And you have a natural valley between the granite hills there. And the groundwater gets focused in that. And it actually forms a sort of an underground flow of water. It's not enough water to, of course, to dilute the lagoon seawater. The lagoon is actually as salty as seawater or saltier from evaporation, but it is enough of a flow to sustain the Pragmitis. And what impresses me about Pragmitis when I've done sampling it before, it has a very thick interwoven root mass. And I think what it can do with that is it can almost kind of exclude other water from it. So it gets this fresh water in, it's growing this very thick root mass, which is in the fresh water, and it almost makes it very difficult for the seawater to penetrate. So it's enough of a flow to sustain it. And the other place you see Pragmitis is in estuaries, like the Berg River estuary. You'll see salt marsh on the edges, but in the middle of the estuary will be these little islands of Pragmitis that I think again are sustained by this lighter, less dense fresh water in the groundwater that's helping them be sustained. So I hope that answers that question. And I'm sorry, John,
that,
just remind me, what was the first one about?
so that one about alien invasion clearing, has that yielded some
Oh, yeah,
sort of
yeah.
positivity?
The alien invasion clearing definitely, I think, has been shown to have an impact, because if you think of a tree, what is a tree? It's a water pump, actually, because it's has an extensive underground root complex, right, which is drawing water up to it, up to the leaves, which have to respire with the atmosphere. And so they are continually bleeding water into the atmosphere. You don't see it, the water. It says water vapor, but it's escaping through their leaves. So a large tree like a eucalypt or a pine or oak, will be continually feeding groundwater to the atmosphere. And then if you have the summer winds, they just blow that moisture away. It's gone. It's not recycled locally. So by removing those and replacing them with the Cape feignboss, which are, remember, shrubland areas, relatively small leafed, or like the restios, no leaves at all, they're much more naturally water conserving. So the amount of water you'll lose from a feignboss community will be much, much less than with the trees within with the alien trees. So by clearing the trees and replacing them with feignboss, definitely helps retain more groundwater, which ultimately feeds rivers, which ultimately feed downstream communities.
Prof, I would absolutely love. We still have so many people on the call, which indicates just the level of interest that everybody has. And I think what your presentation does, I think it is the foundation of literally life sustainability. It touches on different biomes. It touches on water supply, which is essential for life. You're talking about plants. This is literally the foundation of human evolution and human existence. So I think that's why this presentation is so popular. And that's why 15 minutes into the presentation, or after the presentation, we still have so many people on the call. So without going too many, I think we just have quite a few more questions to go. I think it's safe for us to say these questions definitely need your expertise, and if you could just comment on them just in 1 or 2 sentences, and so that we can upload them on our Facebook page. I think that would be awesome and hugely beneficial for everybody that's joined us on the call. But I don't want to keep anybody waiting any longer on this call, although I can see that everybody is just still excited. I, in fact, have a hand up. So I apologize if I haven't read your question this morning. But I just want to take this opportunity, Prof, while we have you, to just thank you for your passion. Like I said at the beginning of the call, there are 2 kinds of people: those that chase their dreams. Some of us are one of those. We keep dreaming and saying, I want to get there. But I think you are an embodiment of somebody who lives their dream and passion. And we can see that coming through from the work that you do, and just the level of expertise. I actually don't understand why you've stopped teaching, because I think you should continue just empowering this young minds at varsity. So I just want to give you just 2-3 minutes, just a minute or so, just to wrap up. What are your just general thoughts? What do you see in terms of the future of the environment in general? Are we safe?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed speaking today. And I guess to answer your question about why I don't teach anymore is because I wanted to focus on writing. And I think in many ways I can reach more people through books than I can through lecturing. And I certainly enjoyed my time at university lecturing, but I wanted to try to reach a general, bigger audience. And I think what you're saying is right, that, we are faced with many challenges, certainly now. And I think one of the ways forward is for people to try to understand better about where they live, the environment. And through that better understanding will hopefully make choices that are better for everyone, for all the organisms. I mean, as an example, what I did during lockdown was I transformed my weed infested lawn into feinboss, and I'm trying to plant it with lowland acid sand, which is what my soil is. It's just quartz sand. It's acidic plants, which are currently, struggling because of all the urbanization and agriculture. So the people can make conscious decisions about how they use water. And people can make a lot of different decisions and how they use solar energy to increase their self-reliance from ESCOM. So I think the more we can learn about these different systems, the more we can appreciate them, the better informed we can be in terms of our own personal actions, right? Our own day-to-day choices. And that I think does add up to make a difference. I certainly hope so. So I am optimistic. I'm always optimistic. Certainly a lot of challenges, but humans are, we like to think we're clever. And I like to think we can come to solutions that work. And if people have questions that weren't answered this morning, they are welcome to, I can visit your page or whatever, or they can send me an email with their questions, and I'm happy to try to answer their questions that way as well. So good to see so many questions and so much interest, because I think that's the key.
Awesome. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Professor John Compton. Please visit his website, www.johnscompton.com. It's got a wealth of information. He's got a blog there that you can actually download as a PDF as well. And there's so many ways to reach him, to interact with him. So please go visit his Facebook, his website. I think it will link you to other social media platforms. But also let me take this opportunity to just thank all our stakeholders that make this possible. Room to Grow, we are so proud. We are so happy to have you as a partner. Straight Nature, it's absolutely great working with a fantastic publisher like yourselves. The last ending slide from Prof indicated a special discount for everybody that has joined us on this call. So please head on to Kirstenbosch Botanical Society bookshop, where you can purchase yourself this particular book. So from today on until the next Wednesday talk, you've got 15% discount. So go and grab this book. I think it's an absolutely must-have. Particularly, I think it's about time that we need to start having this roundtable conversations in our household about just caring for the environment. And I think this book will give you that foundation so that you can step up those conversations. Let me also thank Belinda and the team from working behind the scenes, making this talk possible, and also live on social media pages. Let me thank Kathy Abbott. We absolutely love Kathy. Kathy goes over and beyond the call of duty to find incredible speakers like yourself, Prof. So we are absolutely appreciative of that. Let me wrap it up as well by saying Kirstenbosch continues to thank each and every one of you for all the visits that you do. We want to welcome you. I think we are entering a new season. The weather is looking great. So please come visit the garden. And from myself, John, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you and introducing this wonderful speaker. Let's remember to go and get vaccinated so that we can go and visit this lovely country of ours. Let's mask up, maintain social distancing, and just keep on sanitizing. Ladies and gentlemen, from myself, until we meet again, thank you very much. And Prof, thank you so much for that great presentation.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. We're gonna just just go onto your website and we're just gonna click download, and we're gonna just bombard you with a whole lot of questions. And I do agree with you. You can definitely reach more people with books, and we look forward to getting more material from you. So from myself, thank you, everybody. Have a fantastic day, and until we meet again. Cheers, everybody. Have a good one, Prof.
Bye-bye.
I think we are just about to